Welcome to The Cutting Edge with Dr. Lee Pierson and Dr. Robert Stubblefield. I'm Steve Richins, and on today's show, it's an objective look at objectivity. Or more specifically, Bob's going to take the courageous venture into talking about the socially objective value that Rand talks about in What is Capitalism? But before that, I'm going to give some the traditional view of objectivity, just a sketch, and then a little bit of how Rand sees objectivity. So traditionally, objectivity has been described as a view from nowhere. Objectivity has been seen as detached. Objectivity has been seen as neutral. Objectivity has been seen as impersonal. Objectivity has been seen as fair and balanced. Objectivity has been seen as a bird's eye view or a mountaintop view or God's perspective. And sometimes I hear it used as like moderation in all things. Like truth was something equal or something, and that's just a bizarre notion, flattening all the edges that knowledge is. So objectivity is a central concept in objectivism, and Ayn Rand has a unique perspective on objectivity. In her, the final authority, I'm just going to give some snippets here. Objectivity is both a metaphysical and an epistemological concept. It pertains to the relationship of consciousness to existence. Metaphysically, it's the recognition of the fact that reality exists independent of any perceiver's consciousness. Epistemically, it's the recognition of the fact that the perceiver's consciousness must acquire knowledge of reality by certain means, reason, in accordance with certain rules, logic. And just one other from Dr. Peikoff's perspective, I want to add in chapter 4 on objectivity. One of the subsections is titled. So this isn't definitional, but it's very condensed, and I like it. It just rolls off the tongue, and it speaks a lot. This is a title in the objectivity chapter 4 in OPAR. Objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand. Objectivity as volitional adherence to reality by a method of logic. And with that, I'll hand it over to Lee. I think he has some comments before Bob, and we'll kick the show off.
Well, I don't have much to say. Thanks very much, Steve. That's very good. Gave us a context to work from here. And I think it's quite good. What I would like just to take a moment to stress, which I always like to stress, that this process is volitional, that the process of objectivity requires volitional implementation. And that just in its everyday use, when we try to be objective, what we are normally trying to do is take account of all of the evidence available on the point that we're thinking about and applying logic to that. And that takes volition, because we don't automatically use all of that evidence. Modern psychologists are very hot these days on what they call cognitive biases. Kahneman, the book Thinking Fast and Slow, has a lot on cognitive biases, very hot topic. And it's true that humans are prone to cognitive bias, but what many psychologists don't realize is that we can overcome it. We can overcome bias completely by free will. We can do that by overriding any irrational tendencies and paying attention to all of the evidence that we can get on the point and logically integrating that evidence. So I just wanted to emphasize the importance of free will in the process. And I think at this point, I'll turn it over to Bob Stubblefield, who is going to talk about the socially objective, the idea of socially objective, which is a subcategory, I suppose. Oh, let me say just one other thing. Let me just put a little idea into Bob's head here to think about. Maybe he's already thinking about. Objectivity inherently involves self-correction, the ability to self-correct. We cannot, just by being objective doesn't mean that you are not subject to error. Anybody can make an error. There is no such thing as proof against error. That cannot happen. But what objectivity, an objective process, a volitional objective process, enables us to do is to open-endedly self-correct error. We can correct error and there's no point at which that has to stop. And that's a very important feature, I think, of objectivity of all kinds. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob. How are you doing, Bob?
All right.
Go ahead.
Let's see. I want to give you my conclusion, but first I'm going to narrow the subject a little bit. So far, objectivity has been referring to any conclusion of consciousness. And we notice that in Ayn Rand's What is Capitalism essay, she was referring to objectivity of values. And also in her Virtue of Selfishness essay, she noted that your value must be objective, and the objective is whether or not it furthers life qua man. So objectivity is a broad subject covering everything in your consciousness. And in economics, well, in ethics, you can narrow it to values. And in economics, you can narrow it to values in society. And in her essay, she did go about explaining what a socially objective value was, with a famous example of the telescope versus lipstick, etc. Now, I wanted to narrow it further in one particular thing. If you think of values as desires, so that I want to talk about one particular desire, and that is the will of the people as expressed in laws. So my conclusion is that laws are the socially objective consent of the governed. Okay, now, in order to support that, there are a few things we'll all start with. We realize that the government is an agency of force. Force is a very important concept. It's the essence of what a government is. And we also know that the laws should be objective. And what does that mean? Well, as pointed out, they should reflect reality, and they should reflect values of, when you talk about individually objective, what are the values of that individual? What are his choices? What is his context? What if you extend it to a couple? I mean, my objective will is to do X. Now, how about my wife and I? Our objective will is to go or not to go to some concert. What makes it objective? Well, first, it's got to be objective on each of our parts. Further, it has to be objective in the sense that neither of us is forcing the other to make such a decision. So here's where volition is very important, yes. She cannot go against her will. I cannot go against my will. Our combined will is what we happen to agree on. And notice that another important part of this, quote, socially objective in the narrow sense, socially objective for a couple, is that we don't have to agree on something. We can go our separate ways. In other words, we're free to leave this particular social organization with respect to the issue that we're deciding right now. Okay, so let's extend it to a club of people. So what are the desires of the chess club? And what are the rules by which they will agree to meet and have dues or not have dues, etc.? The same sort of constraints apply to make that club a socially objective entity in their decisions, in what their actions are, is that you got to be free to leave the club. And there must be some process by which people reach an agreement. Okay, now let's go to the broader thing of government. Now, it's not every particular desire, it's only one particular desire that we must socially agree on with respect to government. And that's the rule of law. It must be unanimous that we all agree within our society to abide by the rule of law. We must be free to leave that government. We must have some process by which we reach an agreement. And of course, that's rather complex as governments go. We've got a system of three divisions of government. We've got a legislature, and we've got states. We've got several levels of government. There must be a process. There are a couple of constraints on the process, which those constraints apply to at every level, whether it's a government or a club or a couple. Again, free to leave, and must be a process by which you reach decision. And the process has constraints on it. The process must be stable in the sense that you must know in advance whether or not something is legal or illegal. And the process must be flexible in the sense that it can't be independent of any changes of context. Okay, now I maintain that the laws of a society represent the consent of the government with respect to when and how force can be used, if and when that society leaves you free to leave the society, has a process for everybody, every individual in the society, to have some means of expressing their will, and that process is objective. And here's where we get into the rest of it, the details, the philosophy of law, if you will. Now, I think I have said enough that you should agree with me. So I will, at this point, take questions of disagreement.
You want to go, Steve?
Well, I don't really have anything to disagree. I have a question, but it's perhaps later. Do you have any disagreements? I mean, yeah.
I have a couple of questions. I don't know. You want to go, Steve, or?
Well, there's socially objective is not a variety of objectivity, but as Rand says, it's an application of the concept of objectivity. What would be a variety? This might be a later. What would be a variety if there is such a thing?
Oh,
a
Well,
variety of objects.
let me contrast socially objective will of the people with an intrinsic will of the people, or with a subjective will of the people.
Good. Let's do that. Yeah. Go ahead, Bob.
So if you have a society where the laws are changing from one moment to the next, or they're impossible to understand, you have a subjective variety. If you have the 10 Commandments, which are set in stone and cannot be ever revised, you have an intrinsic variety. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, let me throw in one for a subjective application of objectivity. The San Francisco City Board of Supervisors recently confirmed that armed robot police will be permissible to deal with citizenry. And I find that detached and subjective.
Haven't they seen RoboCop, the movie?
Yeah, it's got a not good ending.
Yeah, that's it.
But this is San Francisco we're talking about.
Can you say that again?
He said he's talking about San Francisco, which is not exactly the model for good government, exactly.
Right.
Okay, well, I'm wondering. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Bob.
Well, I mean, what's the issue there, Steve? What are you're saying that's a different.
Is that
considered a version of subjectivity? That's what you're saying.
Yeah, is that a variety of objectivity, pseudo objectivity, but see, I'm not even sure why it's stated it's not a variety. Are there, it doesn't seem that there are any varieties. This is a one truth, universal, and variety just strikes me as not a thing. Unless you're talking about the varieties of psychology, human psychology.
Yeah, see, I don't think it's the objectivity that varies. It's the social versus intrinsic versus objective that varies.
Okay.
So it's a variety of types, and one type is subjective, another type is objective.
Type
so
of
there's
what?
a subjective value, and
value.
there's the objective value.
That makes sense. The most sense.
So Lee, what are your questions?
I've got just a couple minor things, and then we'll go. You got more to say, right? I hope.
Well, I'm not sure. Probably.
All right. So you talked about the need to arrive at agreement, like even with two people, with yourself and your wife, for example. And then you mentioned the chess club, and there has to be some process. Now, in the chess club, if you're deciding, or any other club for that matter, for the most part, if you're deciding about things like dues and when the meeting times will be and how much to spend on chess pieces and chess clocks and so on, a lot of those things, some of those things would be decided by the officers. Some things would be decided by the membership by a process that's called, I believe it's called voting. In other words, democracy.
Yes.
Now, how does democracy fit into this? Into the overall pattern here? How does democracy, which democracy is dangerous. Democracy is how Adolf Hitler achieved power. It's how Socrates was killed. Democracy is not how should I put this? I was about to say intrinsically, and then I stopped myself. It's not an objective process necessarily. I was about to say an intrinsically objective process, but I stopped myself. It's not necessarily an objective process, democracy. I don't think.
But there is something real and good that's behind this concept of democracy. I mean, what it means that people aren't left out totally. Somehow they've got a say. That's the good aspect of democracy.
Right.
And then there's the bad aspect of democracy, and that's everybody knows that's why Socrates took the hemlock. And so that's why the concept of rights limits government. And so that's a crucial aspect of an objective system, is if there has to be a limit such that the individual is never coerced. At least not, he's not initially coerced. He may be coerced in retaliation. So
Now I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I had left that out of it. That's clearly a necessary part of an objective system.
That I would say that that's philosophically objective, not socially objective. The issue of rights.
Yes.
So how should I put this? So the idea of the socially objective is not sufficient to ground government, which I think is what you're trying to do. It sounds like is give us a grounding.
No, let me go for a few examples where this concept might be useful. A government is complex. If we take our current government, our states have different laws. Are the laws of Utah more objective than the laws of Pennsylvania? Are they both socially objective? Is one more philosophically objective? For example, something that's very important right now is the voting rules from one county to another vary within a state. How they're counted, who the representatives are. Is one process more objective than another process? Are both processes socially objective? Now, you're pointing out that rights is philosophically objective. I think is crucial. And what you want to do is, if you have a process, say, the majority decides who gets to be the mayor in this municipality. That's the process. Is that objective? Whereas in another thing, it's the majority of white citizens who determine the mayor. Is that objective? And we both say, well, philosophically, it's not objective. Socially, that's objective in that clearly represents the consent of the people in that particular district. And that's a measure of why we should aim for the philosophically rather than the socially objective. But there are places where things can be, it's like it's optional. Should the age for voting be 21 or 18? Should the rule for statutory rape be 14 or 21? Somewhere there's a cutoff, and one state has one number, another state has another number. Can you argue that one is more philosophically objective than the other? And I would say, well, if you can, then you want to change the rules of the state that is less philosophically objective. But if you can't, then they're both socially objective. You can't prove that one is philosophically objective, but there's nothing to choose between the two. Now, have I addressed what you were wondering about?
Yeah, you're getting there. I just let me try this, but I think I'm getting. I think I know what the answer may be to this. You look at history and you look at voting and democratic elections, and as my mind immediately goes to the horrible example of Adolf Hitler was elected by plurality, but I think there's excellent evidence, I believe, that he had majority support, at least in some of his tenure as the dictator of Germany. But isn't that just totally irrelevant to philosophically objective? I mean, is there any sense in which the Nazi regime was even socially objective? Let's try that question. Let's try it that way.
I have a little trouble with that myself. It's like, in the extreme, you get the government you want, right? And so there's a sense in which there was not enough opposition in Germany to throw that bastard out. So there's a sense in which the society, in fact, consented to Nazi Germany, to all the evils of that. And the extent to which they didn't, or when they hid people away and helped people leave, etc., are the ones who did in fact leave. Now, as soon as he clamped down and stopped letting people leave, you'd say, well, now I don't think I can say socially objective in that case, because force is being used to influence people's ability. So I can draw a line there. Should I draw it before? I don't know. This is like, how many hairs make the beard?
Yeah, but I think you're right in saying the place to draw the line, or the principle by which you draw a line, is the initiation of force. And once we get to that point, you have to draw a line, and there's no such thing as the socially objective initiation of force. Would you agree with that? Yeah.
Right.
All right, that's pretty good. See, I'm thinking also of comparison to other forms of the socially objective, if this applies to politics, and I'm still working on that one. But you look at the Ayn Rand's usage in economics is the application of socially objective to the free market, and that to me ultimately makes sense in an ultimate sense, because the free market has self-corrective mechanisms built into it, and if you're in the free market and you make some decisions that are bad, you lose your money, in the long run, maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually you lose your money. So there are objective consequences. Now, I'm not sure that let me give another example. Science is I would say, you can comment on this if you think this is true, Bob, is a socially objective process, as long as force is not involved, in a free society. In our society, or in the Soviet Union with Lysenko, it was not a socially objective process. But insofar as there is freedom from initiation of force, science is a socially objective process that gets closer, arrives at truths over time, and has an important self-corrective mechanism. The scientific method is built into it that's subjective. That's subjective in a philosophical sense, and so you end up with a not a collective of minds, but an aggregate of minds that are all working, they're cooperating, but it's not one mind. So there is no such thing as collective objectivity in the sense of an overarching single mind, but there is a social objectivity in a social enterprise like science or the free market, in the sense that all these aggregate minds are working together, and as they do so, there is a self-corrective mechanism. If mistakes are made, the system is built in such a way, or exists in such a way, that the mistakes over time get corrected. I'm not sure I see that as the case necessarily in government, Do governments have the self-corrective mechanism, or would you say?
No,
Perhaps they do.
I think in order to classify it as socially objective, the process must have a means of correcting errors. When I said earlier, it's got to be stable but flexible. The flexibility refers to when you encounter errors, you make changes.
Okay. All right. Now, here's another example that I would contrast with the two I mentioned, free market and science. There's another example of a process with a lot of pieces that operate in aggregate. Evolution by natural selection. There's a process, and there is a certain kind of self-correcting in that process, but it's very different. It's somewhat different from the free market or science in that it's not minded. Evolution is a totally mindless. Mother Nature has no mind. She has no foresight, and she does correct. I'm using she, of course, with quotation marks for convenience. But anyway, she does not foresee, because she doesn't have any mentality at all, and she does correct. There are self-corrections, but the self-corrections in evolution are very, how should I say, local in nature. They're immediate. It's not like we can foresee into the future and project in time and space way beyond our current situation. Evolution works with what's there instantly and makes small adjustments locally to things, over time. And over time, you can get big corrections, but it doesn't correct in the way that an objective process does. So does that spark anything in you, Bob?
Well, it's a totally different category. There's no consciousness involved.
Yeah, that's true. So I say it's not totally different. I don't think it's totally different, because there is a kind of an aggregate process with self-correction, but there is an enormous difference when you have minds versus you don't have minds.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I don't. The difference is such that it doesn't cross my mind that I should be worried about.
All right. I guess I was using it as a contrast. Although it is this kind of self-correction we're talking about is not just any old self-correction, but the self-correction of a rational mind or rational minds.
Yeah, I think you would have to believe in God to connect that to objectivity.
Okay. Yeah. Here's a minor thing I wondered about, which touches on government versus anarchy or something. I guess you say there has to be agreement, unanimous agreement. You say, which is a commonly held position, unanimous agreement, and that if you don't, you have to be able to leave. It's necessary for somebody to be able to leave. Well, my question there, it's a small question, but I was wondering, what does it mean to leave? As that's a somewhat ambiguous term. You could mean by leaving, packing up and going from country A to country B, or you could mean by leaving, not packing up, sitting where you are on your own property and just saying, I'm not part of your system anymore. And what are you talking about precisely when you talk about leave?
Well, it's really, you have to be able to not participate in whatever that common action is that you're trying to do. So literally, it could be leaving the country, or it could be let's try to make an example of I don't know, if you choose not to vote, for example, have you left the democratic electoral process? And as long as nobody's forcing you to vote one way or the other, I don't see if that affects the objectivity.
No, I don't. Sometimes I choose to vote and sometimes I don't. I haven't voted every time that I could have, because sometimes it's just not, when I lived in New York City, what election was that? 2000, the most recent 2016 one, I guess. I walked by the polling place, which is right next to where I live, and I decided there's no point in my going into the election in New York is totally determined. There's nothing I'm going to do that's going to make the slightest bit of difference. So I felt I didn't have to make that decision. Whereas I have voted in other elections. So I don't see that voting is a necessity that you have to vote. But obeying the laws is another matter, right? Obeying the laws. So if you decide I'm going to leave, I don't want to consent anymore, or I never consented. Because actually, I don't remember ever consigning anything myself. I don't think I ever did consent, and that's in a more than implicit way. But let's say you don't want to consent anymore. Do you have to leave the country, or can you sit on your property? Which, the sitting on your property brings up the specter of anarchism there, seems to me.
Yeah. There are several ways not to obey the law. And one is to literally defy it. But what law are you talking about? If it's a criminal law, so you shouldn't rob a bank, so you defy it by robbing a bank. Well, so don't complain when we lock you up.
That's force. That's force.
That's right. Or the example that libertarians try to knock Ayn Rand's theories down with is hey, I took your car, but I didn't use force to do it. I just took your car. Well, where's the force involved? And of course, they're missing a very important part of the definition of rights, of defining and sanctioning. And the defining part really defines cases where force is used. The law defines this as my car. Here's my deed, here's my property, here's my whatever, my title. And so if you take my car without my permission, now you're using force. And why is that force when it's not, you didn't beat me up to do it, you just drove my car away. So there you're violating the law. And again, that's criminal, and you should not be, you don't have any say when we lock you up for that, for committing that crime. So what other ways are there to not go along with, to not consent to the law?
I have one if you want one.
Okay, go ahead.
Serving on a jury, and which adjudicates things like, insider trading or drugs. This one actually has come up somewhat practically in my life. I lived in New York City for many years, and they, unlike many other places, they're frequently after you to go on jury duty, and a lot of the cases involve drugs. I didn't want to go on jury duty. I didn't really think they had. I'm not sure about the philosophy of this, but I didn't feel they had the right to force me. And if they paid me their $3 a day or whatever, and I'm an independent consultant, I'm not working for the government or something where they'll pay you while you're doing jury service. I'd end up starving if I did a long thing. So when I resisted when they tried to get me on jury service. And one of the things that I told them was that if I were on a drug case, where it was just wasn't like selling drugs to a minor or something, it was just either possession or selling to adults, that I told them that there's no way I'm going to convict. I'm not going to convict. And that got me off those. Now, I meant that, though, was that proper of me in a society and a rule of law to come out and say I'm going to essentially violate the law? I'm not going to myself sell drugs. I didn't myself sell drugs, but I said I wasn't going to convict anybody. And had I been on the case, fortunately I wasn't, but had I been on it, I think I would not convict. I would not convict Michael Milken of insider trading, for example. And what is the propriety of that under the socially objective theory, that you propose for government? Because under social objective, if I understand under socially objective, I should follow the law, no matter what the hell the law is.
Well, now socially objective doesn't tell you what to do or not to do.
Okay.
It just says the will of the people is such and such. The will of the people is to have you serve on jury duty if you meet these criteria. And if you don't, when you meet those criteria, then the will of the people says you suffer such and such a punishment. Now, is that philosophically objective? Well, now we get into the philosophy of law, and we have to worry about that. But I'm not trying to decide what's really right and wrong right now.
Well, I probably shouldn't keep going into my own case in this. It might get me into trouble. I don't know, but I will. I was, thinking in advance of how to avoid getting into jury duty, because it would have been ruinous to me to do it. And so I had all, in the end, one time they were just about to get me. For one thing, they don't like PhDs, so that often gets you off. Unfortunately, they don't like lawyers. I wish the lawyers were on jury duty all the time, but they're never on jury duty. Anyway, they don't really like PhDs. They don't like people that have their own opinions. Lawyers don't like that. And so there are a lot of ways to kind of angle it to get off. But one time I was just about to get on, and I'm going to not talk about the details of the case that I was going to be put on, but I ended up having to argue in front of a judge why I should not be. And, I could not have argued better if I were pleading before the Supreme Court. I managed to get, but it was a touch and go thing to get myself. And the judge was not happy. I could see his expression was pained, but he had no counter argument. I don't want to go through it, but anyway, am I wrong to try to get off? If the socially objective will of the people is that I should serve, and here I am trying to get off against the socially objective will, what's the story there? I mean,
well, see, you're mixing two dimensions. Socially objective is an assessment. It doesn't say whether or not it's moral. So by your morality, I think you were perfectly fine.
Okay, so
but the morality expressed by the will of the people may well have locked you up.
well, I prevailed. Fortunately, had it come to that, I would have served on the jury in preference to being locked up. But it didn't come to that point. Okay, but that raises the question then, for me at least, I'm back to, if that's the case, if I'm not obeying the socially objective will in such cases, why do I need a concept of socially objective in the political realm? What is the function of that? What are to do it? Let me phrase the question in the objectivist manner. What are the facts of reality that give rise to this as a necessary concept, and what does it do for me? Why do I need it? Why couldn't I just say they have this will? That's it, and not necessarily break it down in terms of objective, intrinsic, or subjective, which could be any in any particular society. It might be any of those. There's a society that follows the 10 Commandments. There's a society that follows, what's the bad guy in the Bad Scientist in Atlas? Not Stadler, but the real, not Stadler.
Ferris.
The other Ferris. Ferris wants the laws to be subjective. He admits that. He says explicitly, I want subject. So there are, and some societies follow that. And some societies are at least an approximation to objective. Now, I guess I'm switching to philosophical there, maybe. But I'm not sure. Tell me something about why we need this concept of socially objective in the political realm.
Well, you can certainly identify the anarchy as being subjective and totalitarian as being intrinsic, and constitutionally recognizing rights as being socially objective. And then you want to say, yeah, well, within these various things that are socially objective, is there one better than the other? And you would like to be able to classify them, but now you use philosophically objective to say whether or not one is better than the other. And you use the flexibility, that is the constitutional amendment route or whatever, in order to adjust the one that is not as good as the other. So I think it's an issue of measurement and judgment.
The offhand, and again, we're just talking here. This is the cutting edge. We're working on the edge, and so I'm just throwing out ideas. I'm not fixed to this, but offhand, I would have said almost the opposite of what you said. I would have said the issues regarding totalitarianism versus anarchy versus properly limited government are entirely philosophically objective issues. Issues of whether or not they're philosophically objective. They're issues of philosophical judgment. That's how you decide whether a given country is totalitarian or anarchist or properly limited government. You decide that by philosophical reasoning. And I would have said the socially objective has nothing to do with that. That would have been my immediate response. Is there something wrong with that?
No, I don't think so. I think that gets to the essence of it. But you want to look at the cases moving one way or the other. The ones that are borderline. You asked about the Nazi Germany, for example, and philosophically that was hideous.
Yeah.
But it was still socially objective until he clamped down on leaving her. And what that is telling you is something about the will of the people who are in that jurisdiction.
It tells you that their will was not objective.
Yes.
So maybe I'm just confusing myself here, but I don't see the need or the applicability of the category of socially objective, because all I really have there is there's the will of the people. Okay, I know that exists, and I know that in the case of Nazi Germany, it was, let's say, not objective. I mean, the distinction between intrinsic and subjective, as you know, ultimately really breaks down and becomes subjective. I mean, everything else is really subjective, epistemologically speaking. So let me put it that way: the will of the people, on average, in Nazi Germany was subjective, not objective. And I don't see that even the term socially objective should be applied in that case. It seems to me, anyway. But go ahead. Maybe you have some further insight here.
Let me cite something that got me started on thinking about this. Compare immigration laws of Israel to immigration laws of the United States.
Oh.
Is one set of laws more philosophically objective than the other?
Possibly.
Probably not.
Well, it might be. I don't, I'm not familiar with them in detail enough. I don't know if I'm quite ready to, at this moment, to jump into immigration as a topic. Maybe we'll take that up some other time. Because
the thing that got me thinking about this is that it seems eminently reasonable for people in the society of Israel to have stricter immigration laws and tests and screening for people entering their country.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Than it does for us in the United States.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. Of course, when your enemies are that close and surround you on all sides, and are constantly saying they're going to drive, it's pretty clear that but I would say that's philosophically objective. You see, I don't think the social issue. To me, it would. Let me put it this way: if the left wing of Israel suddenly entirely prevailed, and they're loose, let's say they're a lot looser on that, to me that wouldn't matter to the issue at all. It would still be the case that it is valid for them to have strict immigration laws, and it's objectively correct for them to do so, regardless of whether the citizens of the country recognize it or not. So I don't think the socially objective. I just don't see how that matters in making that determination.
Well, it matters in the sense that it tells you that the citizenry is pacifist and is apt to destroy itself, as opposed to the citizen is going to defend itself. Supposing the United States had rigid screening laws for immigrants, why would we do that? Well, our process is such, the laws are such, and that's what comes out. Now, is that socially objective?
That's a question for you, Bob.
Yeah, I say it is.
Uh-huh.
I say it's not philosophically objective.
All right. What if we have?
But it is socially objective.
This is a slippery. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
It's socially objective in that it represents the consent of the government. It's a tacit consent that there are not. I mean, we will find people breaking laws about that, but if they endure the penalties of whatever the law respects, then instead they're really still consenting to that. Now, I agree that is not philosophically objective, that is too strict. And so that is a measure of what we should be doing in order to change it.
Yeah.
But it is a fact that right now our society accepts that.
Okay. So, but I again, to me, I agree with you, but I would say if I called it socially subjective, let me sharpen the case, go down the slippery slope and go to the extremes a little bit. What about Jim Crow laws, segregation laws, and ultimately, what about slavery? Slavery isn't maybe such an obvious, egregious violation of human rights, but the point is, I wouldn't call any of that stuff socially objective. I would just say it's subjective. And so if people have, if they're
well, but you want to contrast it with something that's literally subjective, right? I mean,
no, I think the advocacy of, maybe I'm being too honorific, but someone who advocates enforced segregation enforced by law, their thought process must necessarily be subjective. I mean, their mental process.
Agreed.
We call it thinking. We don't even call it thinking, but whatever it is, it's subjective. So that's what I would call it. And I don't see any.
Does that make the whole society subjective?
If that's the will of if the people vote in Jim Crow laws, if they do so, or segregation, which they would do in the South, which they did do. I don't know all the details, but they certainly did. Yeah, that would be, I've lost the question. That would be subjective. And I don't see there's any point in I just don't see the point in referring to any process there as socially objective. If their judgments are subjective, they're subjective. To me, I'm going to go back. The thing that is valuable about referring to something as socially objective. Maybe this is what I think the essence is, and maybe this is not right, but I think it's the fact that in a free market process, when we apply it to the free market is inherently, I'll say that not innately or what's the other term? Anyway, it's inherently self-correcting. The free market is built-in inherent self-correction, and that's what makes it gives it value for us to call that socially objective. If that were not the case, if the free market didn't have those inherent self-correcting tendencies, I would strongly object to the idea of calling the market process socially objective. I think that would be a big mistake. That's my view here.
But our social system also has a correcting mechanism, but it's a much longer time frame than the immediate correction of the free market.
Yeah, I use the term inherent here to describe that because that's not inherent in just any old political system. It's not even really inherent in ours because it was imperfectly realized.
Well,
even by the genius of Madison.
It was originally intended and it was designed. There's flaws in the design.
Yeah. And it doesn't exist in all. In some societies, that self-correction doesn't exist at all in the political system in any sense of objective. I guess you can always revolt.
But I think your same objection rules out the market price as being representatives of social value.
Oh, I was talking about
at any point in time, there could be a whole lot of irrational people deciding.
Yes. At any point,
there is a price that is socially objective.
All right. First of all, to me, the concept does not apply at a slice of a moment of time. In the first place, it only applies over time, and as I understand it and see it. Secondly, and I get this from Rob Tarr's article. What's the title of that? Anyway, Rob Tarr's article on economics. Price is not really the focus of the concept of socially objective. It's more like the aggregate production or something of, because it's the old thing that the Austrian economists like Karl Menger discussed at length, that water is a tremendous value, but it doesn't have a high price. So price is not really the right place to look for socially objective value. And this is all covered in Rob's article.
The title of the article is Economic Theory and Conceptions of Value.
Economic Theory and Conceptions of Value. And it's in the book that's titled what, Steve? What's the book title? Or
Capitalism, Economics,
Foundations.
Here it is, the research staff. Foundations of a Free Society, Reflections on Ayn Rand's Political Philosophy. And it's part 4. The first chapter in part 4. So that's where I'm getting this, that price is no object, if I may put it that way. It's something else. It's some kind of aggregate, production or something. I'm not sure if there's a simple way of describing the concept, but Rob takes it up, and he points out, I think, quite correctly. And this goes back the notion that price. This is a paradox that the Austrians solved with marginal utility. Was the idea of water is really, in a sense, much more valuable than diamonds. You can't drink diamonds. So anyway, but I guess my more fundamental objection is that when we're talking about objective value, you cannot be talking about a momentary slice of time. It just doesn't apply, because there are all kinds of mistakes. People can buy drugs that destroy them. People can buy astrological paraphernalia, all kinds of stuff. It's over time that the market has self-corrective mechanisms. You can't expect those mechanisms to operate instantaneously. That's my answer to that. And we're getting to the point. You want to sum up with anything, Bob? Because I think we're getting to the point, if I'm not mistaken. Where's my watch? Yeah, it's about time to head out. But Bob, this is your show, so to speak. So please, if you want to make a few summary remarks.
No, I just want to repeat what I started with.
Okay.
Is
That's
that
good.
I see the law, the legal system, as socially objective consent of the governed within that jurisdiction under the constraints of people are free to leave the jurisdiction and initiation of force is outlawed in the jurisdiction. So that's my summary.
Okay, very good. Steve, you want to lead us off into the promised land of Clubhouse?
Sure. First, let's thank our
Yes.
super chat. Only super
Super
chat
chat.
is, but it's not a question. It's just a contribution. So thanks, Kimjetti Bizcheck. And I know
Okay.
I'm butchering the name. So my apologies. So thanks for joining us today. And we'll see you over at Clubhouse if you choose to venture into this idea, this discussion. Thanks for being with us today. And goodbye.